Hello everybody and welcome to week 5. This week we are focusing on issues of globalization, sustainability, and economic justice. Given my lengthy video last week, I'm going to try to keep this short and sweet as we work our way through the material. So in addition to the readings that you need to do, which I will talk about in a bit, you still have some other activities that you need to participate in. One is I want you to work your way through the online activity at inequality.is. It's an exercise where it's an interactive exercise, and I'm curious to see what comes out of it for you, how you liked it, what you learned, things like that. So make sure that you do that exercise. And you also need to watch 2 films for this week. One is Walmart, The High Cost of Low Prices, and the other one is Waging a Living. And so both those are available for you. The Walmart film is available via YouTube, and so it should be embedded in your shell. And the other one, all you have to do is look for the online access through the ASU library in order to get access to it. Okay, so in terms of our readings this week, they, as usual, are broad in terms of the information that they cover. It is definitely not exhaustive. Obviously, when I make syllabi, I have to pick and choose on what we can cover, and so none of the material in any of these sections are exhaustive, but they are providing you an overall glimpse of issues of economic inequality. And so that's pretty broadly defined, but we're looking at issues of globalization and the effects of globalization. We're looking at issues of sustainability, and then, of course, at issues of economic justice. And so one reading that you're going to be doing is Ta-Nehisi Coates's The Case for Reparations. And so it's a lengthy piece, and it is jam-packed full of historical detail, and it's an important piece because a lot of the ways in which we talk about making amends for past wrongs is through this rhetoric of reparations, and yet that doesn't tend to happen very frequently. We never actually get to reparations in most cases. As the article points out, there's a congressman out of Detroit who puts forth HR 40 every year in hopes of even getting the backing to investigate what reparations could look like, particularly for the African American community post-slavery. And so this is a very important piece that frames how different practices, both legal policy practices, but also financial practices, economic practices, etc., have established a significant economic disparity within the United States that typically has a racialized component to it. And so things like residential segregation, white flight, redlining, all of this has to do with that. So that's the first one. In James Baldwin's Fifth Avenue Uptown, it provides you with a very vivid picture of how he grew up, what he saw, what he lived through, and really portrays this idea of how we have very segregated communities when we like to think that, post Brown versus the Board of Education, there is no real such thing as segregation. And yet, economically, we have people who are divided and who are stuck in areas that are often crime-ridden and don't have the same kind of amenities as other places. And so he is a great person to look at in terms of talking about how communities, particularly poor African American communities, are just geographically spaced and struggled. You also are reading Cohen and Kennedy's essentially definition of globalization. And so by the end of it, you should be able to understand and have a grasp of what globalization is and why it's important. Obviously, we live in a global economy. We trade with people around the world. We buy and sell goods. And with globalization has come some very good positives, but also some not so great negatives. And there have been a lot of unintended consequences of globalization. And so it's important to recognize those and to think about those. And so it's a succinct way of understanding and defining globalization. In Mark Rank's Poverty as a Structural Failing, he breaks down the notion that we have in the United States, which several of your other authors have talked about, is this idea of poverty as an individual, personal failing, right? So it's poor people's fault that they are poor. Often when we talk about poverty, we completely neglect the structural dimensions that are at play when we think about poverty. And so he's providing you with other ways to think about it, and he provides additional perspectives on how we can instead frame poverty in the United States as an issue of a structural failing rather than an individual failing, which is really important because it helps us to then frame policies, frame conversations. Even just the rhetoric in the media about poverty could shift if we started looking at it as a structural issue. You know, there are winners and losers, but that game is rigged. And so it's important to think about how it's not an individual failing that someone is poor. And it's not individuals who create poverty in the United States. It is a structural thing. Okay, you also have Charles Guzman's and Shepard's The Roots of Environmental Justice. And so this is a brief chapter from an edited volume that really just is providing you with the history of the environmental justice movement and why it's important. And so when we're thinking about issues of globalization and sustainability and issues of economic justice, it's important to take into account the environmental component of this. And so we have winners and losers in these games. And so, for example, we have individuals who are living near landfills because they are from impoverished communities that don't have the resources to fight when landfills want to come in, or when big corporations that often taint the water or do things like that, because often those institutions, those organizations, those businesses choose to put their businesses in impoverished areas, knowing that those people often don't have the resources to fight back. And then lastly, looking at Levin's piece called Is Capitalism a Disease? A Crisis in the U.S. Public Health. And so here, Levins is trying to advocate for a discussion about how in this economic game of winners and losers, people who do not have the financial resources are often less healthy. So if you don't have the money to go to the doctor for preventative care, if you don't have the resources to buy your medicine, to go see a doctor as frequently as possible, to pay for your chemo treatments, you know, obviously people who do not have the resources for that are often less healthy and often perish in this capitalistic notion that we have about how we distribute income, how we distribute health care, etc. And so it's a pretty important piece in thinking just about how our economic system has repercussions on our health system, on our political economy, on things like that. And just to put this into perspective, everything that we're reading this week, think about how communities are rebuilding post Hurricane Harvey and Hurricane Irma. And so think about it both in terms of while the devastation was occurring, and so what kinds of communities aren't able to go get hotel rooms, flee to neighbors or relatives in other areas around the country, have the kinds of resources to stockpile goods and food and things to ride out the weather. You know, we tend to see, particularly in these kinds of natural disasters, that impoverished communities get it the worst, right? So typically, those who live on floodplains, that's where they had the opportunity to purchase a home. And so that, you know, often that is an individual blaming. We blame people who live on floodplains, but we have to think about sort of the economic surroundings of that. Also with rebuilding, right? So people who are middle class and upper class typically have the resources, the safety nets, the economic safety nets to rebuild. So say their house is demolished, they have the ability to rebuild. Often those who are in lower socioeconomic statuses or in impoverished communities don't have that option. And so we really see, you know, this natural disaster, it affects people very differently. And a lot of that has to do with the ways in which we understand wealth, the ways in which communities are divided, and how we distribute resources throughout the United States. So that's what you got this week. We are moving quite rapidly through our sessions, so be sure to stay on top of due dates and quizzes and discussion boards and start thinking about your final paper, which will be due here shortly. Make sure that you've looked at the guidelines within your Blackboard shell, and if you have any questions that you reach out and let me know. All right, have a great week.